Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Sonic Bloom TV. We're on episode 5. I'm Justin,
I'm Eric.
and we're co-founders of Sonic Bloom, which is a audio tech company. But basically, we want to, do like an hour every week where we could shine a spotlight on industry news from industry perspectives, as well as, shine a spotlight on game audio, the stuff that's near and dear to us, so that we can give, the regular graphics focus a bit of a rest and focus more on like how game audio is sort of changing over this next generation, which we expect we'll see a lot more of this coming soon. But in the meantime, we'll cover news of the week, and we usually have like an end topic that we focus on. So if you like what we're doing, join us every week on Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be doing this, and then we'll make it available on YouTube as well.
We do try to be responsive to questions in the chat. So if there are questions or comments, we'll call them out. If, we see them.
Says you. I'm pretty bad at it, actually.
Yeah. I also need to get myself like onto it so I can actually follow when there are comments. But
yeah. Cool. So let's cover the news.
Yep.
I guess the first piece is, it's kind of a pat on our own back, but last week we covered, it was the first time we covered some of the Switch Pro rumors. And we had sort of talked about like what we thought were feasible rumors, which was primarily focused on a next-gen Tegra chip, or whatever NVIDIA is going to call it, that was capable of doing DLSS, so that output to TV could theoretically hit a 4K upscaled or super sampled image. We also talked about the likelihood of an OLED based off of Bloomberg rumors, and how feasible that is in the next gen. And then we didn't actually talk pricing about it. I think we can talk about it this time. But the fun part is that essentially, I think like 3 days after we posted that, in comes Bloomberg and pretty much says exactly what we did, which is like, here's what's feasible.
Yeah, so they put everything together. To review, we basically said that the OLEDs were going to be the rigid OLEDs. That was the rumor, and it seemed to make sense. A lot of people in the media were kind of extrapolating from that, saying, "Oh, does this mean we're going to have like the Switch Pro and a whole new model and a new generation of Switch?" And we kind of dialed that back and said, all of this stuff seems to be coming together at the right time for a fall kind of holiday 2021 release. It seems like, a new core chip, especially given that NVIDIA supply chain rumors had them shutting down their X1 Plus, Tegra X1 Plus system on a chip fabrication that was just basically going to shut it down. Well, Nintendo needs to get their chips from somewhere. So getting a new batch of chips, like a current gen version, and a higher res screen, or at least a different technology of a screen, that is lower on battery cost, and theoretically brighter, would be great. And it seems to make sense for where Nintendo is. And our kind of summation of that was, it feels like this could be a intergener, like, it's not we don't foresee this as being, here is Switch 2, right? It's probably going to be like what happened mid generation with the PS4 Pro. All the games will be backwards compatible. It's not like your current Switch is suddenly not going to play Switch games. But if you happen to have the new one, you will have the benefit of 4K playback capability when connected to a TV. That was kind of our thing.
I will deviate a bit. Whoa.
Whoa! Dial it back a little bit.
I will deviate a bit. In which I think there's people seem to be vacillating between like, oh, it's more like the PS Pro or PS4 Pro, where it's like where they sort of took the approach of like, let's give more computational power, but it's only going to be used for upsampling to get a 4K image at a high resolution, native resolution than the PS4 is capable of, and at times maintaining a higher frame rate. But graphically, there was no significant change between either. Not quite the same for the Xbox One X, There actually have been some weird deviations there, but let's just not talk about that specifically because it's only a case by case basis. But I think that what's going to be interesting is that whatever the next generation Tegra chip is, I think they're going to do a wholesale swap. Like you're not going to see like we'll keep the old PS or the old Switch on shelves and then we'll have the new one available as well and discount. There may be a small time period where it is just clear out stock, but basically you're not going to have both models occupying shelf space for a while going forward. I think likely is going to happen is full on swap out, which would be in line with the rumors of NVIDIA stopping the manufacture of the original Tegra X1 chip. And what that means is that because mobile advances have been pretty robust over the past 4 years, that there probably will be graphical upgrades. And it's probably going to make I think Nintendo will take a slightly different path, which is not just graphical boosts, or like resolution boosts and frame rate boosts, but I think you're actually going to see like graphical changes. But to your point is I think it's likely that it's going to be, as a developer, you have to support both platforms. It has to be fully backwards compatible. So it'll have to target X1 profile and whatever the next NVIDIA chip is.
Yeah, I imagine that at the very least you'll have for the developer, the APIs should be 100% compatible, like compile compatible, and that there might just be extra options that you can enable for the platform for the new platform.
And it's also going to be developer by developer, right? Like, if it includes enhanced graphic features, like I don't know, new types.
It's opt-in.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So I think that'll bring us to our next item on the docket.
Well, actually, there's one extra point though I'd like to say.
Okay. What's that?
Pricing. What do you think the pricing is going to likely to be?
Oh yeah, I expect that the pricing will remain basically the same. Nintendo's in a fun spot right now. There could be a period where they, I think the Switch is right now $300, which is the same price as the Xbox One Xbox Series S. Microsoft. But that's $300. It's the same price. You really can't go Nintendo unless they came out and said like, oh, we're gonna be blowing your mind with the visuals and the audio and the new system is going to be a totally new generation. It's hard to justify that amount of money when you could get a Series S and possibly a Series X for slightly more. So I could see a period where they're doing like $350 for until the Switch stock leaves, in which case it would be $300. I think it's more likely that the new Switch, whatever it's going to be called, will come out at $300 and they'll bump the remaining stock of the current Switch down to like $250.
Yeah, I think Nintendo's overall strategy is to do like a seamless transition that won't alienate people. Right. And there's reasons to believe this, as their president, it seems to be indicating as much in saying that the transition from Wii to Wii U was a bad idea and they don't want to repeat the problems that they did then. There's also the history of them doing this with like DS Lite and whatever, like mid-generation refreshes they would do of their handheld hardware. And I also think they're in a position where, as of current, the Switch is probably making a pretty healthy profit at their sales point, per unit, and that gives them space to maybe break even with a new generation model, but still not lose money on it. Still at like $300 or slightly higher, they'd still be making a profit on it, and they're in a good position to go ahead and just like sort of pull the rug out from people and do a whole hardware refresh without any major price differences. And the only thing that people have to ponder is like, I own a last generation Switch. Should I upgrade to the new generation Switch to get 4K output?
Yeah. Do
you want to cover this topic?
Yeah, sure. So Sony is going to finally be shutting down their PlayStation 3 and PSP stores in June. July 2nd. 2 dates actually. And then so the original PSP still has the store available, and then there's the PS3 store which is available. Those are going to be closed on July 2nd. What's not been stated is whether you'll be able to download the games that you own from their servers or not. I think you will be able to,
I
but
think there was a statement made that was like you're going to be able to do
you'll
that.
you just won't be able to get new content. If there's a game you were like, oh, there's that PS3 game or that PSP game I'd love to own, and I had the disc but I lost it, like that's the way to get it now. Um, that August 27th, about a month and a half later, just about 2 months later, um, the PSP Vita store will be shut down. That will leave only the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 stores up.
Yep.
Um, yeah. So, what do you think this means for those three platforms: PSP Vita, and PS3?
The only well, it's interesting, but what's kind of interesting is PS3 and PSP had only limited support for what you could purchase in the stores. Like they didn't have full titles. They had PS1 games
Right.
that were their ports. I think there's some ported PS2 games if I recall correctly. But mostly they were like, digital games that were only sold online, that were available. So it's not quite like the PS4 where you could buy like an entire back catalog, and right now that entire back catalog is supported by the future generation. Presumably they'll try to maintain as long as possible. But
forward,
yeah. But I think a lot of people are troubled by the idea that's like, well, if you make digital purchases, what happens to them? And do I just lose access to it? And it seems to be that they're not going to be that cold-hearted about it. Like if you own the consoles and they're connected online, you should still be able to get access to your digital content and be able to authenticate it and use it. And who knows, they might patch it in the future to make it even like to take out some of the authentication steps, to make it just easier so that, you're not going to be, if they shut down a server or something like that, it fails to authenticate and you're no longer going to access the game. But I mean, my guess is they're not going to lock you out of your content you own, but it also means you can't buy new content. So it's like there's a time limit on your ability to actually pick up new content, and especially the PS1 games, which as of right now don't function on PS4 or PS5. So if you want to get a hold of those things, you may want to check out the store over the next couple of weeks and make your purchases now.
But maybe it doesn't matter as much anymore with most of the games being forwards compatible. And on the Xbox side of this whole concept, they're trying to make all their Xbox games available, like forwards compatible straight up to whatever machine you have. And on the PlayStation side, all PS4 games run on the PS5, minor exceptions here and there, but and presumably that, as Justin said, that's what they're going to want to do. So,
So next topic is the Ps2 Prototype Dump, which is kind of fun. Basically, some dude was going about like purchasing these like unreleased discs from the PS2 era, but basically they're prototype discs, which we'll talk about more. But he's amassed over 700 PS2 discs, and there's more on other consoles that he has. But he's worked with an organization and given them like free reign to back up and host all these copies, so that people who can burn PS2 discs and run them have access to all of them, which is pretty neat. There's some like pretty weird implications for it because the legality of this is dubious at best. There's some altruism that's in effect here as well. So I'd like to kind of talk about that and drill into this a bit. I think first of all, I think Eric, you can speak to this, so can I. But what do you think these discs actually are?
Yeah, so they appear to be coming from several different purposes. They're pre-release to as an overarching kind of classification, and generally, they can be things that were versions of games, vertical slices of games. Like here is the first two levels of the game that we've completed as best we can, to show off at E3. Now that can be shown to journalists or it can be shown to retail stores. Back in PS2 era, everything was done through Toys R Us and Walmart and the GameStop and Electronics Boutique, all those shows, or excuse me, retail stores. So those were kind of like, okay, let me sit down in this controlled environment. And at E3, there were the big booths with like everybody trying to attract journalists, and then underneath that tier in the LA Convention Center was this, you'd walk down these stairs and it was a very quiet, weird space because it would open up and there were just this sea of cubicles. And all the cubes had like, a logo on it for this the developer, the publisher, there. And they were just meeting rooms. They were places that you would sit down and you would either shop to a distributor or a retail chain, or you would even do, I'm a developer and I've created a game, I have a demo I want to show to a publisher to sell and get them to like fund the rest of the development of this project. So they'll shop it around and show a bunch of publishers to try to drum up interest. This is a great way to have everybody in one area and you can do these quick demos. So these are the types of builds that we're looking at where, you're sitting down and it might actually be someone from the studio who knows exactly how to play the game so it doesn't crash. And if you try to play it yourself, it's not going to work right, or you'll very quickly find a thing where now you're looking off into space and there's just nothing. It's just black. It's a void. Um, there are a lot of these weird edge cases, and even um, the showroom floor stuff at E3 was frequently quite, you had to go in and understand this is not a complete game because things would freeze, controls would feel a little janky, and a lot of that would get cleaned up before the actual release. You'd always kind of be like, try to look and see what the potential of this game was going to be at those shows. PAX is similar to that these days, but more consumer oriented. And I think my impression, having been to a few PAX at this point, is that the PAX builds are usually much closer to release than the ones that they show at E3, which is where people would be like, big announcement, here's the new game. And we're, that happens at PAX, but their games are usually a little further along. Oh, is there something that am I missing a piece of that, Justin, or is that kind of doing a good job?
No, I mean there's a little bit more, but basically, I mean what you're saying. There's also a common term from called vertical slice builds, which are basically like they're pre-alpha builds, but basically they're like here's what we expect experience to be. Like famously, Ken Levine, who did BioShock, did that with BioShock. Like BioShock wasn't even anywhere close to being done, but what he showed at E3 was a vertical slice, and I think it was actually playable. But yeah, like showed off like this beautiful concept of like what this game could be in like video form that was using in-game rendering on the Xbox, to show off like what that game was going to be. But all it was is like a really narrow, polished piece of it that said like, here's the experience that we intend to sell. They executed on it too, for the most part, in the final build. But yeah, like these are the type of builds that they are. So prototype might not even 100% be the case. From what I could see as well, like some of these things will look like internal studio builds. That would be like,
oh, good point.
Yeah, like where people would essentially spit off a build from the development from the day before, and you would, create like 30, 40 copies of them, distribute them to whoever needed to do play tests on it, QA, producers, whatever else, so they could actually see like the progress of things and test like, in development systems during alpha and beta development. I mean, when I worked at a studio, it's like we would produce hundreds of these builds per day. And so there'd just be tons of these floating around, but they always were supposed to wind up in a shredder. So
yeah,
clearly this one.
Well, we'll see. It'll be interesting. It's good for Internet Archive, and it's like a piece of gaming history.
Yeah, and I actually that's kind of like the point that the next sort of thing I want to talk about, which was like, yeah, I outside of the dubious legal framework in which these things are getting released, like where do you feel like this falls? Because in one hand, it's studios aren't preserving these things, and it is part of the history of like the gaming industry. But on the other hand, like I'm not sure if, as a developer, I'd want some of these early prototypes just making it out to the public either.
No, not at all. There's even the little demo stuff that we're building. There are versions of this demo that we're building where we don't want general people to play it because they look at it and they would just be lost. You look at it and these are pre-release for a reason. There's a reason it's not released yet. It doesn't represent your best effort. It doesn't represent what you're going for. And to have people see that could be interesting for some people that are kind of like history minded or are interested in seeing the process. But for the general population, I think it just would make you look bad as a developer.
Yeah.
I know for me, I would prefer that people didn't see things. Let me say this, there are projects that I've worked on where early versions of those projects were incredible, and I wish that people could see them. And then the projects that they became were either canceled, which no one ever got to see it, or they were kind of morphed aesthetically into something different and, not for me, less appealing. And those types of situations also exist, and I would love for people to play kind of certain builds of games that we had built for demoing to certain publishers or whatever as a sales pitch. They're good enough that we wanted to show them to people outside of the studio. And sometimes those I would be happy with context, but to just have it show up in like a box and someone's going to upload it into a machine and then it's just on a website, like there's no context there. And that kind of feels not as good. If it became like a wiki and developers could come in and add commentary, that could be really interesting.
Yeah. I'd also like to say that some builds have stuff that the public's definitely not supposed to see, and that doesn't come in terms of like, oh, the content's not ready. It's like, no, developers can be crass and put in like placeholder names that like would get them in trouble.
Yes.
I mean, there's lots of stuff like that.
I've worked on games where people like to hide phalluses throughout development in the backgrounds of things, and no, they get cleansed before ship. We know that.
Yeah.
Those builds, if they saw the light of day, you'd be like, what is going on here? Like, okay.
I mean, and actually earlier this, I think it was earlier this year where like the Nintendo leak happened.
Yeah. Yep.
And then it wasn't just like the builds, like there was like, internal communications between developers and people were discovering like some of the horrible things that were said. And they're like, oh, I can't. And it's just like, yeah, I mean, maybe the internal dialogue between like a male dominant studio is like regrettable. And the cultures have shifted and changed over time. But I think the lens in which we look at things today are different than they were yesterday. And that stuff can like get people in some hot water when it's like historically out of context. It's not that it's right. It's definitely not right, but it's also like there's some grace that has to be given here. All right. Last bit of news. This one's kind of fun because weird studio stuff.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of this one. So this is that Amazon is opening a new game studio in Montreal. I think a month or so after Google shut down their studios there, and are just kind of like presumably just sopping up all the development and talent there. Google had been working on their own IP. Now Amazon, and then they shut down this studio. And then, Amazon comes in and says, oh, well, we're going to make a studio there and we'll start do our own IP here now too, like the same position. And, what's odd is the timing, given that they had like only recently shut down their own studios. I think they closed the studios right after they shut down the team that
Amazon or Google?
Amazon. That the Crucible team, did they disband them, or did they just
I can't say how much of it was actually disbanded, but the studio was closed and they had massive layoffs. So I mean, like that development was halted in a weird way too, because that one went into beta twice. It was in beta, then released, and then it was not well received and went back into beta, and then it was canceled. clearly Amazon wants this model of game to function, right? Like we know games as a service works sometimes. Uh, we know there's an awful lot of opportunity there, because there's maybe like 10, 15 games at any given time that are seeing huge, like massive player counts and makes tons of money. Biggest one being
Fortnite.
What was that?
Fortnite.
Yeah, Fortnite, from Epic, and just like the runaway success that they had, and the like gobs of money they were hoovering up from all the players. Amazon is like weirdly, I mean, they're a service-based company at this point. Like easily, they're wholly into services now. So clearly that they wanna capitalize on the same sort of thing with games.
Yeah.
But how successful do you think a studio or a company like Amazon can be at creating creative studios that can produce a hit, without trying?
Not as a company has the ability or the expertise in the right managerial positions and positions of kind of business ownership to be able to give the developers that space. It was clear that Google didn't. Like the Google approach just did not fly. And that's why Google shut down their teams. They basically said like, yeah, this doesn't mesh with us. It's not who we are.
Right.
and at least they were honest about it. We'll see if Amazon can learn and make that work.
I mean, right now they're just going, can we pull in team members from Ubisoft who were
Yep.
critical in making things like Rainbow Six function to make like some sort of games as a service game. I will say that's like typically big companies aren't really capable of doing this. Like there's obvious examples that like early on, Epic was able to do it with Fortnite, but it didn't go smoothly at first. Like that game was in development for a long time before it actually saw its critical success. You could say
they also weren't a game developer studio so much anymore. When they started that was during their UE3 days, Unreal Engine 3. I remember seeing very, very early builds of that game.
Yeah, I remember seeing it at GDC early on. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
they already had the experience making, UT, which
right. The original Unreal and then Unreal Tournament, and then they assigned some smaller team and they said like, look, flex the new technology, and they even did a number of other smaller games before they hit on Fortnite. Like there was one where you were in this little like room and there were you were these little kind of chibi style people, I think, and you would run around in this dungeon style look, kind of like a fantasy world. It's a demo I believe that they put together and they shipped to developers so that you could see how to do things in Unreal. That was, by the way, it was early on that they would do a lot of that stuff. There was a 2D side-scrolling 3D game, like all the assets were 3D, but it was 2D, and you would run and kind of jump around and shoot at things. Justin, do you remember what that was called? Do you remember what game I'm talking about?
No.
I don't remember what it was, but they had a game.
There was one that was published by Epic that on the Xbox 360 called.
So my understanding, and I could very, very well be wrong about that, was the early versions of Fortnite were another effort to like, let's just build another thing, and this time we'll do it. And then it took off.
I think the point is though is that they have the chops to do it, right? Like they were a game development house for a long time with the Unreal series, with the games that we talked about, with Gears of War. All that stuff was developed prior to Fortnite, or in parallel with, per se.
It also wasn't a standard game. Like they didn't have to go to a publisher and say pay for this, right? It was for them. It was their internal teams working on flexing their own engine, which is what they had been selling. That's where they made their money, was on selling the engine technology.
And I think the only other examples really are like Blizzard, which with Overwatch, which just saw a massive cut to their development team. But you have Blizzard with their entries, which to be fair was early on. Like the only other games that were kind of competing at the time were like, what is it called, DayZ and games of that nature. Before we saw like Fortnite and then stuff that's similar to Fortnite coming out from smaller developers. But the real success that you see, like where you like, oh, this game just is making huge amounts of money, and lately has either come from the established studios like Blizzard, like Epic, like Riot Games. But basically,
And
there's like the major developers are the ones that are responsible for some of these like perennial hits that have been working, but all because in large part they have a lot of experience developing games, and they have been in the place where they've already developed games that are similar, and then they moved into games as a service, and it's worked okay for them, minus some hiccups um, Anthem like failing miserably, but like Bungie succeeding really well with Destiny. So like clearly Amazon wants to get in on the cash grab, but it's probably going to be an uphill battle for them to actually like launch a game that people will trust to be good and sell an experience that people will enjoy.
yeah, and yeah, there are other kind of lesser known games that are doing very well these days too, but it's also pandemic times. It's hard to.
And it's also coming from small studios that are agile enough to
Yeah,
rapidly prototype and to like test and to scale organically, opposed to just having like we have the bank account to blast this into everybody's marketing, or like into everybody's YouTube video for a marketing stream. It's like these are things that are organically grow because people really enjoy the experience. Amazon's not going to do that. There's no way Amazon does that. Amazon's going to be like, bullhorn trying to get it into everybody's, hands, and people I don't think are as accepting as that of that method, because it seems like you're being force fed something that's supposed to be good, opposed to naturally gravitating to something that people actually value.
yep.
So yeah, now we get to sort of talk about the topic I picked for this week. I'll give some prefacing to this. IGN actually posted this really cool video last week. I think it was it was late last week. But they were interviewing Thomas Puha. Again, I probably botched his last name. Guy's Scandinavian, I believe. Sorry, but he's from Remedy, the developers of many great games, but their latest game, Control, which was mostly a PC-based game that they managed to get running on the PS4 and that generation, and they've just patched it to be updated for PS5 and Xbox Series X and Xbox Series S. So I had an interview with him, and he brought some kind of points that we've talked about before in other videos. But I think the main ones, I'll set up the video itself so people can actually see it. But he talked, IGN interviewed him about like what it was like to actually develop like an intergenerational game, and he has some tough words, I would say, is the nicest way to put it. So let me cue up that clip so that people can actually see it. And then we'll talk about it. So let me switch things here, and let's cue it up. Let's get it running.
So tell us about porting Control to next-gen consoles. Obviously, you shipped on last gen in 2019. Then when you came to work on the PS5 and Xbox Series X versions, what sort of challenges and new opportunities did those provide?
Great question. Well, the challenge is that whenever you're in this cross-generational point, to be blunt, it sucks. You gotta support the previous gen, make sure that syncs, and then whatever you kind of bring to next gen is still honestly pretty limited by the choices you made years ago for the previous generation. Mm-hmm. And it's not a very realistic thing that, well, this old game, we're just going to remake everything and then bring it to next gen. It's just not like that. That's not a reality for us, because you're literally taking away resources that are building the future games and improving the engine for the future.
Well, then the clip that I showed mostly focused on the first question that they asked, which was what's it like to develop intergeneration, and his statement is it sucks. But do you want to kind of like elaborate on stuff like that, because this is something we've talked about,
yes.
and like I think a lot of it too is like people get like people who aren't developers will be like, what's so hard about it? What's so hard about getting a game that was developed for PS4 to run well on PS5? And it's already working on the PC, so it should just be a simple port. And and then get upset about performance as well. So what's your take on this, Eric?
Yeah, so it's never as easy as the platform holders would like you to believe. Every time that you have to like, even the PS4 to PS4 Pro and the Xbox One and Xbox One S and the Xbox One X, all of that added complexity to the process. It's not as simple as, you set a few lines in your code base and you're done, or you can change a configuration file. I guess it could be, but you're going to have things that run basically the same for all of them, and it won't take advantage of the features. People like to say like, oh yeah, just dial back the what's it called there, ray tracing for your rendering, because that's easy. Like, doing a whole ray trace renderer is like, that is a piece of the puzzle, and pulling out that piece might have implications for a whole bunch of other stuff. And it's like, you might be able to build it up as an optional toggle, but there's a lot of work that goes into making that happen, rather than just saying, we know exactly what this platform is and we can make it all work the same way. Like, we'll just build that. Now we have to build that, and then the version of that without it, and make sure that they all look good and do all the QA there. That's the big thing. I think he does call that out too, where QA is a huge factor on every time you add a new machine, a new target box, you have to, test on it. If you make an optimization, if you're working on something that's graphically for the upper tier platform, and you make a configuration setting change, that could potentially break stuff for the because of how interwoven all the systems are in a game. That could potentially break things in unforeseen ways on the other consoles. So you still have to check that and run it through all of its paces and everything.
Not to mention that, like, just like, there is a degree of like, oh, I can toggle on all these settings which are configured,
Right.
but in doing so, you usually create performance bottlenecks that you need to optimize for. And because you have a solid set of hardware, you're when you're doing performance profiling and whatnot, you're saying like, oh, in this room that we have a lot of, I don't know, ray trace lighting in, it crushes the performance, and suddenly you're dropping from 60 frames to 30 frames. Like, that's unacceptable in today's games. So these people spend a ton of time like doing specific optimizations in places so that you get a consistent performance from the game itself.
Yeah, and some optimizations are cheaper than others. You can have, for instance, you might say like, oh, I don't have as much RAM in the Xbox One S, or excuse me, Series S, that I do in the Xbox Series X. So I'll have to downres all of my textures, which means that I now have to either output them as two separate textures, one for the X and one for the S, or I output them as the X and then have an automated process as part of my build system that makes a lower resolution version, some percentage smaller, for the S, so that everything will fit in RAM. That's still overhead that you have to deal with, and then you have to manage the assets in the back end, like put them in the network and the source control in some way so that they're properly tracked. And then that's fairly straightforward. Resizing an image is, we know how to do that pretty well. Resize or shrinking a model, like reducing the poly count and the vertex count on a model or a mesh, can be quite a bit more complex, because there are decimation algorithms where you can basically take a high poly object and shrink it down and make it less vertex filled and less polygon filled, but it might look real jank if you use the automated process. So usually there's hand tweaking that has to come in for that tier of approach, and that's going to increase your cost. So every time that you have to try to fit something into where you were ambitious, in particular, which just happens a lot in the AAA space, Control is a prime example of that type of game. You're going to struggle and have to be very careful about how you handle all that stuff. If you're working, it's a little bit of a different story. If you're working on an indie title and you're not trying to, push the boundary of rendering techniques and all that other stuff. If you have a clean aesthetic and a clean style, you might use some of the new features in the engines like Unity or Unreal to some interesting effect, effect that may or may not take 100% advantage of the resources on the top tier consoles. And typically indies don't have enough time to really optimize for the different platforms. So they'll just kind of make the lowest one work and then say, great, we did it and ship that. And maybe they'll work it a way to like get the resolution higher and whatnot. But, Microsoft showed off early on Ori and it wasn't the Blind Forest. It was the second one, I think, which I'm blanking on the name of right now. But one of the Ori games. And they showed it running at 4K, and they were like 4K 60 or 4K 120, I can't remember. But it was like, it apparently looks stellar, and it looks amazing at that. They're also effectively like a Microsoft first-party title for that modification. Microsoft was funding that optimization. So, there are these costs available, and Microsoft does a lot of marketing to make it so that this is clearly how it's done. Their goal was to make it so that people would get a hint of the next generation with the Series S and make it easier for more people to jump on the bandwagon. But as I think we've discussed in the past, that may also be more of just a Trojan horse to get people more excited about their service, the Game Pass service. In which case, especially with the cloud rendering coming.
Good points. There's also another thing that he brings up, Thomas brings up, and he goes, it's sort of like this tug of war he has, because a lot of studios nowadays are doing double development or like two title development.
Yes.
Basically, you have this is a typical cycle for a lot of companies, but basically, there's everybody should know, or if you don't, now you will. You have like a early development, pre-alpha development phase. Alpha phase is when you're trying to solidify your systems and gray box out the rough shape of what the game is. Those things that you're working on during alpha will solidify to your beta. Your beta is when you have sort of finalized the mechanics of it, and you're working on bugs and refinement and art for the most part, and then like final design, and then you'll then move from beta to content lock, and you'll be at that point aiming for a gold master candidate by adhering to the standards that you need to hit, and then doing like these sort of early tests that you do with either your publisher or in the case with like Microsoft's, I think, and Sony will allow you to do an early submission to do like a first read on as to how closely you meet their standards that they ask at a price. But the point of all that is by the time most studios are hitting beta, the majority of 1 second, there is a nice ice cream truck again.
Can you get
perfectly timing itself for when I'm trying to do this?
I would like some chocolate.
I would like one of those SpongeBob or Spider-Man pops with the M&M eyes. Yeah, good stuff. But
good call.
Yeah. And someday I'll actually catch it. I'm gonna like book it out there and be like, give me Spider-Man. Rocket pop. But the point of it is that a lot of studios will at the point in which beta, you lock sort of beta with your main title that's going to see probably release within 6 months to a year. You start prototyping new stuff for a future build, and you have like a small set of your team on there. And as you get closer to content lock, you start transitioning more over, and et cetera, et cetera. But once you release, usually there's a small reprieve, and then you move your team over to whatever you were working on in the past. And this is what places like Remedy will do, and EA and everybody else that's working on multiple titles at once. The point of this is that at the point Remedy released a year ago, Control, they were focusing on bug fixes probably for 3 months afterwards, and then were really trying to ramp down most of their development on it. So when they had the opportunity to provide a PS5 or next gen patch that would work for PS5, Xbox Series X, suddenly the team is being asked to spend time optimizing for a brand new platform. And he brings up the point, it's like, this takes resources away from our development. Like, how much time do we really want to put into this before we start really taking away from our ability to put in the features we want in our next game that's going to be like a purely next gen experience? And how do we not pull away from that? And I think that's like an important point, because it's hard to expect this from a studio. Like, it's hard to expect someone like Remedy to be like, drop everything you're doing. The game that sold okay or did well, and is only going to get minimal value out of a next gen upgrade, is worth sinking that time into it to pull it away from like your next gen or your next title.
It is a balance to strike, for sure. I think it makes sense for games like Control to be done. They were A, beautiful games that came out, and B, late enough in the generation that there may be people that were holding off and hoping that they would release something. And they're good enough, already looking good enough, that like updating the visuals could be enough to get people to say like, wow, this is what the next gen can do, even though it's really not. It's kind of like a scratching the surface story. But yeah, was there more that we wanted to show from that video?
Yeah, there's actually one other video clip, because a following question comes up, which is, I think they're like inquiring like, oh, we want to see the way the sausage gets made, and it specifically asks like, what is it like to develop across the new generation? Like, how is it different to develop for the PS5, Series X, and Series S? And Thomas gives kind of a smirk there, because you can see he's holding back some opinions. This is something, again, that we've talked about. I'll play the video clip, and then I'll elaborate a bit more, and then we'll talk about it. So let me get that going.
Cue it up.
Will do.
And then Series S, well, it's it's no different from like the previous generations, where like the system with the lowest specs does end up dictating a few of the things that you're going to do, because you're going to have to run on that system, right?
Yeah.
And it's very easy to say that, well, you just like lower your resolution and texture quality and off you go. It's just nowhere near that simple. Like, it sounds good when you say it, and every engine is built in a different way. It's another thing when gamers might be, like these idiots, like this game engine like does all of these things. Well, it depends on, are you making like an engine that's much more about GPU bound or CPU bound? Like, which are you taxing a whole lot more? Well, we kind of tax kind of both, because we have a lot of physics, but then we have a lot of the ray tracing effects. But then that makes a huge difference, especially on Series S. So
yeah, he was asked about the Series S, and he sort of talks about stuff that we've talked about before, which was, he actually likens it more to the last generation than the current generation, and that the minimum spec is sort of what you have to adhere to if you're going to be doing cross console, or like like third party approach, where you're targeting all of the available consoles for that generation, and that it's not an easy process. Contrary to what people like, like the studio heads at Microsoft will say, it's like, oh, it's just upscaling. It's like, it's not. It depends on how your game's developed, of course, but I think what you'll see is more and more of the next generation how much that isn't true, and I don't know. There's more to unpack there, and I think it's mostly going to be dispelling what the misnomers are about development and why the Series S is like not going to be a lead weight on developers for this next generation. Eric, I know you have a lot of strong ideas on this, so do you want to take away?
Yeah, I mean, I was very much bummed out when I saw that Microsoft had done the Series S approach out of the gate. When I saw that was a thing, and there were the rumors about Lockhart that I didn't want to believe. I was really hopeful that it was some kind of like intergenerational. It's a 1XS or 1X Plus or whatever. Maybe it was a bumped up version of the 1X, and they would stop selling all other versions of the one. The fact that they've done that basically sets that as the bar for the generation. That is the min spec. You could argue that some people will see the Switch being that there are enough players that they want to target that as well, but there are typically more drastic things that people do to make the game work on the Switch.
Yeah, I mean, the Switch is a bad example for one reason specifically. One is basically which, like, it's been fine for an indie platform, but for like AAA games like Doom, they've put a lot of work into making something like Doom work, and more and more now developers are like, we're just not going to develop for Switch. We're going to treat it as a streaming platform. Which works, but like, I don't think it's an unrealistic thing to expect that may very well be the case for the Series S as well, where it's just like, don't even bother.
Yeah, exactly. If Microsoft eventually gets to a point, maybe that's their goal, partway through this generation, they'll say, guess what? Locks are off. Go. Like, the Series X is actually the console you can develop for, because anyone who has a Series S will be able to play those games. They just might have to play it through Game Pass and online, and then you can stream it, and the Series S will output to 4K. Great. That will work. That's great.
And it might actually be worth saying too. It's like, where does the Series S actually fall in things? Basically, the Series S platform is certainly a way for Microsoft to be able to pull a larger yield out of their chip manufacturing. This is stuff we've gone over before, but basically, when you manufacture a small process, which I think this chip's on a 7 nanometer process. Could be wrong on that. It might be slightly larger, but basically it's small. They're prone to error, and basically the more cores you have, the more likely are you to have some failures. Typically, what will happen is, like, say for the PlayStation, I think, which has 32 cores on the GPU, that they'll produce a processor with 40 cores with the full expectation that 8 of those cores will typically be unusable, and they will deactivate the ones that are over, and things that are under that 32, they will not sell that chip, and it has to be recycled. Microsoft took a fairly smart approach and said, why do that when we can have a failed chip and cut down our GPU yield to at a minimum 20 for us to be able to get away with a functional chip. So this is what the Series S is. It's essentially like a non-recycled failure of a chip, but they keep the core speed on the CPU the same.
No, the core speed of the CPU is slightly, or is it the GPU?
It's the GPU.
One of them,
GPU has a slower
GPU. That's right. You're right.
So
I did check. It's 7 nanometers is their
okay.
fab
So it is
process.
7 nanometers. Which is the size at which they are laying down circuitry inside of the silicon. It's like their etching size. So anyways, the point of this is that the Series S is same CPU. GPU has gone from 52 cores, I think is what the GPU core count is, and down to 20. Lower clock speed on the GPU, lower RAM bus on the GPU, and or at least the rewrite speed. And then
the real quick comment: the CPU is slightly slower.
Okay, so the CPU also gets downclocked a little bit. Basically, their justification is like, well, for $300 it gets you a console, and you'll just not try to put out 4K at whatever 60 frames a second. You'll target lower. They suggest a target of 1440 with a max 120 frame output speed
refresh rate,
temporal speed, which even at this point is not holding to be very true, with a lot of games targeting like 1440 or a dynamic 1440, so targeting 1440 max with it scaling down when the system gets overburdened. And then frame rates usually holding around 60, and in some cases 30 frames per second. But so that's the recap of what exactly the hardware is. But it's the GPU core difference that I think is the biggest thing that hurts it. And Microsoft's justification is, well, you just want output at a higher frame rate. But do you want to cover some like the use cases, Eric, why this is not exactly true and why it actually hurts people, and why I think Remedy is particularly upset about it?
Yeah, so you do more than just graphics rendering on a GPU these days. There's GPU is a thing that I mean, people mine tokens, right? Like Bitcoin on GPUs. That's not rendering. You can do physics operations on GPUs, and a lot of systems are kind of optimizing. Like if they say, oh, this simulation is going to have particle effects and everything, not just rendering particles, but positioning and all that other stuff. It's really good for massively distributed or parallel operations, especially when they're all running the same process, which particles typically are. So there's all these different things that you can do on the GPU. It's not just like I'll turn down the number of pixels I'm drawing and that's it. It can be more complicated. You're limiting the flexibility of the algorithms that the engine itself can use to do all the work that it needs to do to render a frame. Of course, the GPU is going to be used for the rendering, but it can also be used to do compute work. It's called compute buffers, and you can just tell the GPU, please go do this work for me and let me know the results, and I will then integrate those and then use it to adjust my visuals or my physics or my simulation or whatever. And games are doing this more and more. They're becoming, looking at which of the CPU or GPU cycles do I have for free for my game, and trying to take advantage of that. And now that balance that needs to be struck, it has to be done twice. It has to be done for the Series X and the Series S. On top of, if you want to do multi-platform, then you're looking at doing that on the PlayStation 5 as well, and PC possibly, if you're looking at that, that has its own can of worms that we all know about.
Yeah, I think the point here is like really that Microsoft having the Series S as a platform really puts more pressure on developers who are already having trouble not only just transitioning to a next generation, but also trying to take that generation and push it forward. And pushing the generation forward isn't just going to be what we're seeing right now in this intergenerational phase, which is like, oh, we can take a game that was running at 1440 native or whatever else, we can get it up to 4K, or we can get it, whatever, at some other resolution, like, whatever the resolution might be, and upscale up to that. And then, have a faster temporal rate. But instead, it's looking at stuff going like, hey, like with the type of extra overhead we have, we can do AI calculations on the GPU. We can do like, as Eric was saying, physics and everything else. And now, as a developer, you might go, I'm optimizing all the cores I have on the powerful hardware. And now I'm suddenly dealing with a deficit of 30 extra cores that I was using to do X, Y, and Z. And I don't have that ability. So, you'll see, it's going to be hard to say what kind of compromises they're going to be able to get away with in order to get something to run on something like the Series S that has such a significant deficit behind the other two platforms, especially when you have to start considering cuts that are beyond refresh rate and resolution.
Yeah, it's literally a third as powerful.
Yeah, it actually slots in. It's less powerful than the 1X.
The 1X, yeah.
It just has the newer instruction set. So
there are more things that you can do, which is nice,
and optimizations as well.
Right, and to be fair, that does enable you to do interesting things that you couldn't do on the 1X. But at the same time, just in terms of raw, compute power. Because that's in terms of teraflops, which is floating point operations, 32-bit numbers that have a decimal in it.
Right, as we know, which isn't like the whole story, but my fear is that it really, for the third parties that have to handle this, it puts
Yep.
an unnecessary burden on the transition over to next gen and the learning curve. And I think it's going to be sorry to say that, like, yeah, Microsoft and their studios are probably going to spend the extra time to optimize for the Series S and have a comparable experience on it. But it means that Sony is also going to be able to get away with not having to make compromises like that for it to run on the PS5, because the PS5's minimum hardware spec is a
Yeah.
lot further ahead. So
Particularly
again,
for
this
their
probably
first-
gives their internal studios an awful lot of
Yeah.
more freedom and less, restrictions about how they develop for the PS5 base versus
Yeah.
Xbox.
Their first and second party studios especially will benefit
Yeah.
from that. In fact, part of the reason I was groaning at the Xbox Series S announcement was because the way I see it, that is going to affect games that show up on the PS5 as well. Because
third parties, especially.
Yeah, the third parties are going to look at it and be like, well, the engine has to run on all three of these machines. We have to make sure it works on the S. So
I just
Cool.
hope that there eventually will just say it's okay to do it like they're doing on Switch right now and saying it's a streaming game. It's not going to be
Yeah.
running natively on the hardware. It will be streamed in, and if you don't have an internet connection, you're not going to be able to run it, or whatever
yeah,
else.
if it's a competitive game, you probably want to sell your console and get one of the more powerful ones that can run it locally.
Yeah. It's just a lousy, and I think it's a bit disingenuous with how they sold the console. Like, it's perfectly a parallel experience.
It is a
supporting as low
next gen
resolution.
console. Like, okay.
I mean, it
It
is.
does. Yeah, it
but-
does have the faster
CPU.
yeah, it does have a faster CPU. I was going for the big one this generation is the hard drive speed. The
Yeah.
read speeds for the hard drive and just how fast you can transfer assets, both on the Series X and the Xbox consoles and the PS5. Like, it is crazy how much faster that stuff is, and that is already a massive experience win. Microsoft with their ability to jump in and out of games and between games, like that is amazing. And PS5 to an extent has that. It's less polished and less nice. But it is still amazing to like boot up your console and then
Have a game running within 30 seconds.
Yeah, or less.
Yeah.
You hit the button, once you log in, it just takes you right to the game and you're in again, from sleep. You're like, okay, great, I'll take it.
And actually, to this point, I think this is probably the last point we can make too, is that Remedy, Thomas over at Remedy. I'm not gonna say his last name because I know I'm just botching it. But the encouraging thing he says is he's like, oh, the stuff that we're working on now will blow people's minds away. It's like, because the performance bottom that they have to meet, they're no longer going to be shackled to, being able to run performant software on the old generation. That what they're able to do, what they're able to render, what sort of additional features they're able to do. And it may mean a compromise at not running at 60 frames a second, but running at a steady 30 or whatever it is. But they're super excited about what they're able to do now. So I think everybody doesn't have to look at this intergeneration of games and say this is the performance that we should expect and this is how we expect things to look. Instead, he's saying no, it's going to get a lot better from here. And the sort of, the lead weight that we're dragging around, which is the last generation and to some degree the Series S, once we're able to free ourselves of that, what we're able to do is gonna be amazing.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what Remedy and others are cooking up for us right now.
Because they're already pushing the envelope with physics simulations and smoke and volumetric physics, fluid dynamics.
And imagine what's going to happen with another 5 to 7 years of just know-how advancements. We just constantly get the march of progress and
just optimizations, right? Last week we talked about DLSS and that gives an extra 20 to 30% of computational
GPU
overhead that you get to suddenly free up because you're not trying to produce images at 4K, native 4K, or native whatever 2K. You're going no, we can actually get away with doing this at
I'll render at 720p and just let that small little box of the hardware handle all the stuff that would have taken me 8 times that space
Yeah.
of just die space to do on my own in the brute force way.
Right. And at the trade-off of making like much more alive and lush environments that, you know, I think for me who likes single player, like story driven narratives, like if you can give me a more convincing world that looks more realistic, that sounds more realistic, then I'm more than happy to compromise things like frame rate and resolution as long as it's stable.
Yeah. I have only on a handful of moments been upset about lower frame rate. I'm usually okay with 25 to 30, unless it's in like a really intense moment where you're like the Twitch reaction is really important.
Yeah, like I don't want that on like a Street Fighter, but
right.
in a game where like they focus on delaying your inputs for animation anyways, it's like, well, the like 30 millisecond lag that we get because of a frame rate update, that is going to be 100 millisecond lag because of an animation update or like an animation playthrough. It's like it doesn't really matter at that point in time, and I'm happy to, as long as you can lock a 30 and not give me fluctuating frame rates, I'm happy with what they'll be able to give. So
cool.
Yeah, covers everything for today, for this week.
Sure does.
So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll post the full video on YouTube, and we'll keep it up on Twitch after the fact. And with less technical issues that we've had this week, which is great.
It's a constant upward trend here.
Yeah.
So be improving.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next week.
Yeah. Thanks everybody.
Take care.
See ya.